Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time you are tuning in. Welcome to Homesteading and Gardening in the Suburbs. I'm Emma from Misfit Gardening, and August is often a really busy time on the homestead, right? You're trying to juggle getting crops started for fall, you're trying to preserve the harvest, there's lots of things all going on, and today I kind of wanted to dig in and share some important tasks for your garden and homestead. So let's get started with number one, which is deep clean your animals. If you're living in the burbs, then you probably are already cleaning out your animals on a regular basis, right? You want to be keeping your coops, hutches and pens clean. That helps to reduce problems in your animals, like health problems and things, but it also helps to reduce smells, complaints from the neighbors, and also reduce flies. When I lived back in Utah, I cleaned out the chicken coop every week when I was in the suburbs, mostly skimming off the poop and replacing bedding as necessary, but then I did a deep clean and I really scrubbed out the coop to clear out any potential nasties, things like mites or lice or the black widow spiders that would seek shelter in the dry spaces that were in the coop. My hubby tackled the spiders. I was not going anywhere near them, but then once he'd cleared out the spiders, I could get in there and really scrub out the coop with hot soapy water and a stiff brush. I would let everything dry out on a nice sunny day and then replace the bedding, and we were good to go. And I would do a couple of these deep cleans throughout the year. I would usually do another one before the snow showed up. So that was around Thanksgiving when we were back out west. I would also deep clean during like the February thaw or early March. So things were kind of cleaned out from the funk from over winter, and that helped keep my birds in a much healthier and happier condition. One of my chickens was a Rhode Island red that we'd called Ginger, and that was a giant mistake, naming the chickens, but that's for another podcast episode. But every time like I would be cleaning out the coop, she would be kind of like knocking on the coop door where the ramp was to let the birds out. She always wanted to be in. She kind of wanted to be wherever I was, like when I was out in the garden and stuff. She would be following me around, like pecking over things. But yeah, whenever I was cleaning out the coop, she was determined to get in, and she always wanted to be like the first bird into the coop as well after it had all been cleaned out, and she always seemed a lot happier. That was a weird chicken. She was more like a dog, I think. So anyway, having a coop in one location is very common if you're living in the suburbs, right? Usually there's city ordinances around having chickens, and certainly there was in the city that I lived in. It was very, very clear you had to have the coop. It needed to be in one place, and it had to be X amount of feet from the boundary line, X amount of feet from the road, like X amount of feet even from the house. So there was a very strict kind of area that it had to be in, and the ordinance officer or the code enforcer had to come, and you had to submit plans where you were going to keep your chickens, and then the code enforcer had to come actually look at the site and see where you were going to put it. They even wanted to see your design plans of the chicken coop. The coop itself had to meet a certain requirement, so it was only allowed to be so many square feet. So you had to get very creative in terms of like where the birds were going to be, and really make use of having the actual coop raised up off the floor to make use of space under the coop, so you know the birds had more room. But of course, having a coop in one location, as per the city ordinance, it meant that things got kind of stinky on the ground where the coop was, because the birds weren't allowed out to do anything. So wet weather and chicken poo makes for a real stink, and flies and stuff got attracted to it very quickly. So I would be digging out some of that stuff, you know, every month at least. I would haul it off to the compost bin, and then I would put down wood shavings and wood chips to help combat some of that high nitrogen stink from the manure. honestly, having gone through that experience out in Utah, that is one of the reasons why I like movable chicken tractors so much. And that's why I'm commissioning my woodworker husband to build 2 movable coops. One for the meat birds that we're going to be raising and one for the layers. Basically, so we can move the birds around and reduce the buildup of nasties in one spot, right? There's a lot of like pros to having a movable chicken coop. I like the idea of being able to move it around different areas of the garden. They're not getting into the stuff in the garden that I don't want them to be in. I can still move them around the property and they can help take care of various bugs and ticks and stuff. You know, that helps. But I have that assurance that I'm not going to be losing so many from predation. Whereas if they were kind of free ranging, so to speak, then, you know, I've got a real concern where I live of, you know, various things coming and snaffling up a free chicken dinner. Certainly where I live, since we've cleared a lot of the property of the weeds, we have a lot of birds of prey around us now, which is kind of cool to see, but not so cool to see if I am having chickens and stuff. And I know a lot of people where I live are very bothered about foxes and stuff like that. I'm not so bothered about foxes. I would rather have foxes on my property to take care of the mice and the rats. So I'm not so bothered about the foxes. For me, I'm more bothered about the birds of prey. But that's kind of where things shake out. But having, you know, the ability to move them around in a protected area is great, and it really, really does reduce the amount of smell that you get from having a coop in one area. Now, we do have an idea to move a small shed that's currently down by the garden. If you're on the Facebook group, you'll see that shed in some of my pictures that I post of what the garden is looking like. But we're thinking of moving that up to closer to the house and converting it over into a winter coop that is going to be secure, and build an attached run for the layers during winter and have it on the concrete that used to be the massive commercial chicken barn that's now been demolished. On one hand, having it closer to the house means it might deter predators, but on the other, it may actually attract rodents near to the house. And I really don't want to go through the more sleepless nights because of things in the wall. So we've got plenty of time to try and figure out what we're going to do with that. And the shed would need dismantling and moving anyway. But right now, we don't have animals, so that's kind of helpful, and we've still got plenty of time to figure out, well, you know, how do we want this to shake down? I mean, the winters are long here in Maine, so I've got plenty of time to think about it, but really kind of evaluating what it was that we did in the suburbs, what worked and, you know, what did well and what didn't do well is kind of things that we can now build on. Now we've got a little bit more land to, you know, play with. And that was always the point of this homesteading game and why we started doing it in the suburbs. Number one, because it is possible to, you know, raise your own food in the suburbs, but also it was to really build up and learn from our mistakes on a smaller footprint before going all in and trying to do it on a larger scale. Number 2 for tasks for August is really with the recent hot weather is cooling your animals down. Some people have found that to be quite tricky. I remember when I was a kid, we had a pet rabbit called Phoebe, and we used to freeze bottles of water that she could then lay on. And even actually as kids, we used to freeze bottles of water and then take them to school. And then, you know, as you were walking home, because we used to walk to and from school, and, you know, on the 3-mile, you know, trip home, it was, you know, kind of nice to have a cold water to be drinking even when the sun was beating down. So that was kind of nice. But frozen water bottles help not just rabbits, but also chickens. When I had chickens in Utah, I would put frozen water bottles into the chicken coop, some during the day, some overnight. That helped keep the hens cool. I also saved plastic containers like margarine or butter tubs, cottage cheese containers, those kind of things. I would put some peas and corns in them, or maybe some fruits that were a little past their best from the garden. Put those in the empty container, top it with water, and then bang it in the freezer. So the next day I would just push that ice block out with the chicken treats in it and put it into the chicken run. I tended to put it into like a shallow tub, so maybe I took like an old coffee can or something and, cut it in half so there was less, it wasn't quite as tall, so the chickens could get to it a lot easier. But the hens really like to peck at the frozen block to try and get the treats, so it gave them something to do, occupied their minds, which is always important when you've got chickens in a small space, but also it helped to get them more water and help cool them down as well. Other strategies to help cool your livestock are things like moving hutches and coops into the shade if possible, or creating shade with tarps, old blankets, bed sheets, those kind of things. I definitely created shade with tarps when we were in Utah to try and give the chickens a little bit of respite from the sun. I've also seen people set up solar powered fans for their livestock, as well as freezing bigger produce like watermelon or cucumbers and then giving those to the animals if it is safe for them to have those. So just a few ideas to help with your livestock. Number 3 is to get your fall crops planted, and I know I've been talking about fall crops for quite a number of weeks now, but don't forget things like stump rooted carrots, lettuce, beets, Asian greens like mitsuna, tatsoi, bok choy, Kosuma mustards or other varieties of mustards, turnips, radishes, green onions and kale. All of these are fast growing, so you can squeeze a little bit more out of your garden before that first hard frost in fall appears. So make sure you're getting your fall crops planted. I don't want you to miss out on having something for fall. Number 4 is taking notes for your garden journal of how your garden is growing. What plants have you been growing? What has grown well? What did you first start harvesting? And when did you start harvesting? Are there any pests that showed up? Your garden journal is a really great tool to help you plan your next season's garden even better. I think I might have said on a podcast episode, or it might have been in the Facebook group, but I know that I mentioned that I had a tomato variety called Subarctic Plenty, or the world's earliest tomato it's called, and it actually hasn't ripened any quicker than some of the other varieties. I harvested a big pink, like giant slicing tomato that ripened way before these Subarctic Plenty tomatoes, and I've got another variety that looks like it is going to be available ripe well before those as well. So I'm keeping some very keen notes in my garden journal about what varieties are coming ready for a harvest much sooner than others, because I have a shorter growing season than what I used to have when I lived in a zone 7 garden. I'm really focusing in on having varieties that are going to mature well ahead of that frost, and those are the things that I want to be cultivating and saving seeds and growing again in my garden, right? Remember my policy for my landrace garden, right? Does it grow in the time? Does it taste delicious? If it managed to get through like all the pests and diseases and the lack of water and all of that stuff, if it made it through all of that, then I'm basically growing the Marines at this point. So I want things that are going to, thrive, without a lot of input. They just go in and do what they do. And then I can save those seeds and keep growing and keep fostering those type of traits that I want in my garden. So your garden journal is an incredibly useful tool. I mean, I use mine all the time, from updating my seed starting schedule to deciding what to grow every year. And speaking of a seed starting schedule, I posted a video on how to build a more simple version of the seed starting schedule that I use. I go through in the video step by step how to build it in a spreadsheet. So if you are a lover of spreadsheets like me and you want to see how I save time in planning my seed starting, and I have things like when I can expect to harvest and stuff like that in my spreadsheet, then check out that video. The link is going to be in the podcast description for you. So let me know how that goes. Number 5 is harvest regularly. Some plants like peppers, beans, eggplant, summer squashes, they produce more flowers and more fruits, aka the pepper, the bean, the eggplant, or the squash that you're harvesting, right? That's what I mean by fruit. Not necessarily fruit like berries or apples and stuff, but the actual piece of the plant that you are harvesting is known as a fruit. But by harvesting your plants regularly, you can also check out your plant itself for any pests or diseases and get a jump start on treating the issue before it gets out of hand. So whilst I was mulching some tomatoes, I noticed that there was some weird little bugs on the tomato, and I hadn't seen these bugs before. They kind of look a little bit like squash bugs. So I've, later on today, I will be getting out there and trying to get a solid picture of one so I can try and figure out what it is and then how I can go ahead and treat it. But also I'm seeing squash bugs appear on things, so I am busting out some neem oil and I'm going to be trying that to take care of some of the squash bugs. So starting things a lot sooner when you spot an issue with your plant is going to help you try and save the plant so you can get a harvest, but also hopefully it'll help stop things getting out of control so you don't have a terrible infestation on your hands. And of course, having moved from something that was like unkempt pasture to now having a level of somewhat orderly garden going in, like things are not necessarily going to go right in the first garden that I have here, and it takes time for integrated pest management to really start to settle in. I know that I've talked about that before. It can take at least 5 years before you start to see benefits of integrated pest management, so I'd like to kind of hang on a little bit more before I start treating things, but I'm really starting to see like losses of crops by having some of these bugs and things in place. So now I need to step in and start to do something, because the birds and the other insects that are helping with keeping things in check are not able to keep up with it all. So that is one benefit of harvesting regularly and checking out your plants regularly, is hopefully you can rescue a plant before you lose it completely. Let's move on to number 6, which is if you have some plants that have finished producing or have died, or you don't want to save the seeds. Let's say you've got a lettuce that has bolted in the heat. You can pull out those plants from your garden and fill in the space with a quick growing fall crop instead, to be able to get more from your garden, because if you leave the space there without anything growing in it, then you might end up cultivating weeds instead. So you want to get that plant pulled out and pop it into the compost heap if it isn't covered in a disease. Speaking of compost heaps, number 7 is turn your compost pile. You want to be helping to restart that composting process by taking the cover off if you've got a compost heap that's contained, like one of those plastic bins that you can just lift off. You want to dig everything out. You want to be mixing it all up. You want to take out any compost that has actually finished, like stuff that looks like compost, looks like soil. You want to be taking that out as much as you can. Some people put it through a big old sieve that's basically hardware cloth or wire mesh on a frame that they just kind of sift it through into a wheelbarrow. Other people just kind of scrape things up, and if there's one or two bits that are, you know, a little chunky and haven't decomposed, then they toss it back into the compost bin. But yeah, try and pull out anything that you have that is finished, because you can use that around your plants to give them a nutrient boost. But make sure that you are getting your compost all mixed up and turned over. If you've got like a nice fancy multi-bay or a pallet compost heap with additional bays or stalls, just, you know, turn everything over into the next stall. Like, the stuff on top will be less decomposed than the stuff on the bottom, and that's kind of where you're going to see your finished compost is towards the bottom. But turning your compost is adding air into it to help those microbes get the oxygen that they need to kickstart that decomposition process. Mixing stuff up also helps distribute things that may be drier with stuff that is wetter, and that's going to help everything all break down. Your compost pile wants to be moist like a wrung out sponge. So, you know, if you have had a lot of dry weather, you might want to add some water at this point if it is not feeling, you know, moist like a wrung out sponge, but it's a little dry. You also want to make sure things are moist to help deter rodents, and that's also a good reason why you want to be turning your compost heap, is to deter rodents from making it a home. I really want to get to a point where I can turn my compost every week and really speed it up, and have more of a hot composting technique, and maybe that'll be my gardening goal for next year. With the addition of Homestead livestock, I'm going to have a lot more waste to be composted, so there's definitely some value in getting in and turning it a lot sooner, because I'm going to be needing a lot of compost soon. But if you have like tumbling composters and stuff like that, you know, it's easy to be able to you know, empty those and make sure that anything that's a little chunky still that needs to go back into the composter, you can pop that back in and mix everything up and add some more water. I've definitely found having tumbling composters, which are great because they don't have the rodent issue like a large on the ground composter does, but they do dry out very, very quickly. So I like to turn those as often as, you know, I remember to. At least once a week you want to be getting out and turning things. But if you are adding material to them on, you know, a regular basis, like every other day, certainly when I lived in the suburbs, I relied a lot more on my tumbling composter than I do here living more rurally. But I would turn that composter every day, and it certainly helped break things down a lot quicker. So let's move on to number 8, which is August is a good time to start building some frost protection. I built some cold frames from glass windows and doors that I picked up from a thrift store when I was in Utah. We kept growing spinach and cold weather crops in cold frames throughout winter, and then we would use them to start crops in early spring. So a cold frame was a really, really valuable gardening tool, we'll say, that got a lot of use. And cold frames are pretty inexpensive to make, and a lot of the material you can often salvage from around town, or, you know, buy it for very, very cheap by checking out local classifieds, checking out yard sales or estate sales, thrift stores that specialize in home improvement, asking a neighbor who's remodeling, right? You get the idea. You know, there's things that you can often pick up for free or very low cost. Mini hoop houses that just cover the plants in a row, or also known as polytunnels or row covers, they're a little bit more spendy than a cold frame. But they can be made without completely breaking the bank. I will say that I need to research this type of frost protection with a snow load and see if there's a better way to make them. In a more mild climate, you can definitely get away with using Schedule 40 flexible pipe and plastic sheeting, but when there's the weight of snow to contend with, you need something a bit more robust, because that piping is just going to collapse, and that plastic may rip and tear, and then you'll end up losing the crop underneath it. So if you live in a snowy area and you have a hoop house, please let me know how you built it over in the Facebook group. I would love to hear all about it. I loved having hoop houses when we lived in Utah, and I had multiple of them that fit snugly over my raised beds. Like, we actually built them so they fit exactly over the raised bed, and it was great because it kept things growing throughout the dead of winter, and all we needed to do was just lift off and not even lift it off entirely, just lift off one end to be able to reach in and harvest things. And that was a fantastic way to keep the harvest going, but it was something that we focused on building towards the back end of summer, really before all the harvests and stuff started kicking in, because once we got canning we didn't have a lot of time. So if you are still a little bit away from having to go crazy with preserving and all the harvest coming in, maybe take a look and take some time out to build some frost protection for your garden. Number 9 is don't forget weeding and mulching. Weeding is such a time sucker in the garden, but a necessary task for many of us, me included. The old pasture is definitely trying to take back the garden beds right now, so I'm basically weeding a bit, putting mulch down, weeding a bit more, putting mulch down. I am pulling weeds up and just chucking them straight on the ground in some cases. Like, everywhere I look, like there's weeds popping up, apart from when I look over at my no-till garden beds that are ready for next year. I mean, I'm kind of beating myself up that I didn't just plant in those instead, honestly, because there's like no weeds on those beds at all. The mulch is helping to retain the water in the soil, and you know, with no weeds coming up, like, my plants would have a much easier time of growing because they're not fighting the weeds for the sunlight and the nutrients. But mulching generally is really good for the garden. You want it to, you know, it helps retain that moisture in the soil. It helps reduce soil being washed away when it rains, and it'll eventually decompose over time if you're using natural materials, and that's going to feed the soil, and that's never a bad thing. So mulch whenever you can get it is my tip, because I get it, not everybody has mulch available. Some people are using grass clippings, some people are using straw, some people are using, you know, random wood and tree chippings that they managed to get hold of for free. You know, it's really use what you have available, and eventually things will break down. Some people are having better success with straw mulch versus grass mulch, or grass mulch versus wood chips. Like, whatever it is that you end up using in your garden, it's always going to help the soil in the long run when you mulch, so it's always a good thing to do. Also, mulching can help reduce the spread of certain diseases, because you're preventing the soil from splashing up on the leaves of the plant, which can is one method of how certain soil-borne diseases get transmitted and spread across a crop. So mulch when you can. I actually have some shredded junk mail and stuff that's sitting up in my office that I'm going to be using as a mulch in the garden as well. So that's going to be kind of fun to see how the shredded paper is going to fare in the garden versus the wood chip mulch that I'm currently using. All right, let's move on to number 10, which is that I mentioned in a previous episode how I saw on a local farm and other local gardeners how they have a sturdily fenced smaller area for their garden to keep out the deer. And that's what my no-till garden area is going to be. It's going to be fenced in, it's going to be intensively planted, everything's kind of set up in these keyhole gardens, and hopefully I'm going to have less critter damage if I can get rid of the woodchuck that has made a home under the shed that's in there. But that's a different issue. But August is a good time to plan and start setting out garden beds for the next year, especially if you're going to do no dig or sheet mulch or lasagna gardening style like me. And the reason why late summer is good, because you can still see your garden in full light still. You know, you've still got the summer heat and stuff. You can see where the light is falling, what shadows are being cast during the growing season. So it will help you get your garden beds set up in the right direction for maximum light. It also means that you have time to lay the cardboard and put down the wood chips and the other mulches without hurrying that, oh my gosh, snow's predicted tomorrow, right? I need to get this out now, otherwise I'm stuck until spring. And then, you know, there's some debate about how well no-till beds or lasagna gardening or sheet mulch gardening or whatever you want to call it. I go with a no-till. But those kind of beds often kind of have a struggling garden because so much of the materials are being broken down. There's something that's known as nitrogen robbing, which is commonly seen with wood chips, where the nitrogen's being taken up from the soil to help decompose the wood chips and the other materials. So if you can start building your bed while you're not under pressure to get things planted like you are in spring, then those no-till beds have an opportunity to begin to break down, releasing the nutrients and not tying up the nitrogen, which means that you're going to have a much easier time and more places to plant in the following spring. So if you were wanting to move to a no-till bed, now's a good time to get started on that. Number 11, and we're nearly at the end, guys, is get preserving. Since your harvest is on, maybe you're visiting a farmer's market and roadside stands and you're picking up a great deal on fresh produce, or maybe you're going foraging, right? You want to be making sure that you eat, cook and preserve your produce so it doesn't go to waste. I'm a huge fan of canning, and I love canning for many reasons. The biggest one is that we have to fit the meat from a couple of animals in the freezer for my husband, and I like the fact that canning means that things that I'm going to be eating are usually shelf stable. I need my coffee this morning. I've canned everything from meat, tomatoes, pickles, potatoes, stew, and everything in between. I really like to can shelf-stable meals, things like farmer's soup and stuff that are kind of ready in 10 minutes, which is great when you have a 90-minute commute home after a really long day of work and you've set off at like 5:30 to be in the office on time. Like, I get it. It's really easy to, you know, stop somewhere and pick up fast food. But actually having something that you can just dump out into a saucepan from a jar, reheat, and it is homegrown food. Oh, it's so much better. And that's one of the things that I love by canning, is you've got that flexibility to be able to do that. Some things I like to freeze, like raspberries, because you really can have too much jam, and definitely don't make the mistake that I made of doing like 20 million jars of chutney that you don't know what to do with. Okay, it was not quite 20 million, but you get the idea. I've been fermenting quite a lot recently. I've been making sauerkraut in different flavors. I've done kimchi in a variety of spice levels. I've been making lacto-fermented pickles and squickles. That's summer squash pickles. I've been doing a lot more of those kind of preservation techniques. Like fermenting has definitely taken a bigger role in the preservation of produce this year on our homestead. I honestly can't make enough of the spicy lacto-fermented pickles. My family are eating them quicker than I can make them. I do dehydrate a few things here and there, mostly apples in the fall. But one method of preserving that isn't really mentioned when we talk about preserving food is actually cooking with your produce in a bigger batch and then freezing it for a healthy meal that you can defrost and enjoy later in the month or even later in the year. For example, if we're drowning in zucchini or eggplant, then we might make a big batch, put it in a big freezer safe oven proof dish, and we'll do like a big eggplant parm or a big vegan zucchini lasagna for me, and we'll put it in the freezer to defrost and cook later. Or we might fully cook it and then portion it out into one person servings to then take to work for lunch, or microwave and reheat when we get home from work. At least once a month I'll try and batch cook something. Maybe it's like vegetable and barley soup if I've got veggies that are on the brink of going bad, and I'll make a big batch of vegetable broth from the vegetable peels and offcuts, assuming they haven't gone moldy or bad or anything. If that's the case, then those bits go into the compost, but if they're still good, then into the broth they go, and then I'll use that broth for soup and stew and anything else that I'm making that needs a bit of flavour, like maybe cooking rice. There's lots of recipes for canning soup and even canning broth, so if you make a big batch, you can can it to make it shelf stable and then use it later, and then you basically don't have to be buying it from the grocery store. And I noticed broth is pretty expensive. It's like $2.50 or something. It was pretty spendy when I last bought it. So there's a top tip for you to get more out of your produce, is turn some of it into broth as well. And the last one for today is curing garlic. If you've pulled garlic, you want to be putting it somewhere where there's lots of airflow so it can dry out, ready for use later. I like to braid my garlic and then hang it in the basement. That was kind of what I used to do in Utah. Here, maybe not. I might not do that because I would end up with rodents. I would probably braid it and hang it in the kitchen instead. That's kind of where I got a lot of herbs drying at the minute anyway. But also you want to be pre-ordering your garlic for fall if you haven't yet grown it. I love growing garlic. It's pretty straightforward to grow, and although this is the first year since growing garlic myself that I didn't have a harvest because something ate my garlic, and that is crazy because growing garlic around your plants and in with your plants is usually the organic gardener's surefire way to deter critters from your veggies. So I guess whatever ate my garlic must have been really hungry and needed it more than I did. So right now I'm perusing various places to see about ordering seed garlic to plant, and I'm going to be planting that in the no-dig garden bed this fall. So I am really excited to do that. I personally like really strong punchy garlic. I use it a lot in various fermented vegetable recipes, canning and cooking. I like to try different hardneck garlic varieties because I live in a northern state and hardneck varieties do better in the north, and softneck garlic varieties do better in the south. Softneck garlic varieties tend to store longer though than hardneck garlic varieties, so I'll be picking up a few different varieties to try out. I'll be looking for ones based on taste and ones based on storage. I'm going to grow them, see what grows well, see what I like the taste of, and save the cloves from those that I like the taste of to plant the following fall. That sounds a lot like my strategy for landrace gardening, doesn't it? There might be a common theme in how I grow. But I would love to hear from you. What are you doing on your homestead? Let me know over in the Facebook group. And until next time, I hope your garden grows beautifully, and I will see you all next week.